He set out on a simple fishing trip, but when a storm swallowed his boat, he was cast into the Pacific with nothing but his hands, his will, and the endless sea. For 445 days he drifted, facing sharks, starvation, and a loneliness few could even imagine. How did a man survive the longest castaway ordeal in modern history when almost everyone else would have perished within weeks? The sea was calm that morning, the kind of deceptive calm that lulls sailors into believing the ocean is on their side. José Salvador Alvarenga had lived his life on the water, his weathered hands accustomed to nets, his mind tuned to the rhythm of tides. He had been fishing off the coast of Mexico for years, a man known among the crews for his endurance, his humor, and his uncanny ability to find fish even when others returned empty-handed. On November 25, 2012, he set out from the port of Costa Azul in Chiapas, planning nothing more than a 2-day fishing trip. His companion was not one of his usual crewmates but a younger man, Ezequiel Cordoba, just 22 years old, new to the trade, still nervous around the unforgiving sea. Together they loaded a small fiberglass boat with nets, hooks, a radio, and a cooler filled with provisions. There was little more than water, a few tortillas, and enough supplies to last them until their return the following evening. For Alvarenga, this was routine, a trip he had made countless times. For Cordoba, it was an initiation into a world that would demand strength, resilience, and courage. Neither of them could have known how far the ocean would take them. At first, the trip unfolded like any other. The motor buzzed steadily, the sun glittered on the waves, and their nets dipped and rose in time with the swells. They laughed. They spoke of families waiting on shore, and they dreamed of the money they might make if their catch was big enough. By mid-morning, the horizon was still clear, and the men were confident. But the sea changes quickly, and signs of trouble began to emerge. A faint haze spread across the line where sky met water, building into low clouds that darkened as the hours passed. By noon, winds whipped up in sudden bursts, churning the waves. Alvarenga's instincts prickled with unease. He had faced storms before and knew when the ocean was about to bare its teeth. He radioed back to shore, warning that a storm was approaching and asking for guidance. But the reply was thin, crackling, almost drowned out by static. Then, the radio went silent. The storm descended with a ferocity that neither man had expected. Walls of water rose around the tiny boat, battering it from every side. Salt spray stung their eyes. The motor coughed and sputtered as seawater flooded over the stern, and the boat pitched dangerously in the towering swells. Alvarenga shouted instructions, trying to keep Cordoba focused, but panic was setting in. Hours dragged into the night as the storm raged. Black skies lit by lightning, rain pounding down with a sound like drumfire. They bailed water with their bare hands, clinging to the boat as it threatened to roll. Every wave seemed like it might be the one to swallow them whole. When the storm finally eased, both men were soaked, shivering, and exhausted, their provisions drenched, the motor dead, and the radio destroyed. The shoreline was nowhere in sight. They had been cast adrift into the open Pacific. At first, they believed rescue would come quickly. Fishing vessels crossed these waters daily, and surely someone would notice their absence. They rationed what food they had left, drinking carefully from their bottles, chewing the last tortillas with silent prayers. But days passed, and no one came. The sky stretched unbroken, the horizon a circle of nothingness. Their cooler emptied faster than expected. Fish spoiled in the heat, and hunger began to claw at their stomachs. With no motor to guide them back, they drifted wherever the currents pulled, their boat, a helpless speck in a boundless ocean. Alvarenga tried to steady his companion's nerves. He taught Cordoba how to snatch fish with a makeshift line, how to gut a turtle and drink its blood for water, how to seize seabirds when they landed unsuspecting on the boat's edge. He spoke with confidence, repeating that they could endure until someone found them. But Cordoba was not hardened to this life. The taste of raw flesh made him gag. The idea of drinking blood repulsed him, and the endless monotony of water breaking against fiberglass eroded his will. Each day grew heavier than the last. The sun was merciless, peeling their skin, burning their lips until they split. At night, the cold sank into their bones, and they huddled together for warmth. They drifted farther and farther from land, the current carrying them into an abyss with no markers, no landmarks, and no end in sight. 1 week became 2, and the silence deepened. Ships never appeared. Planes did not pass overhead. Their world shrank to the length of the boat, the endless blue sea by day, and the black void by night. Cordoba's laughter faded, replaced by silence and stares into the horizon. Alvarenga filled the void with stories, speaking of his youth in El Salvador, of his daughter waiting for him, of feasts they would have once they returned. But the words could not mask their reality. They were no longer fishermen at sea. They were castaways, and the ocean had swallowed every trace of them. By the second month, desperation had hardened into grim survival. The storm had set the stage, but now the true ordeal began. Hunger and thirst would become their constant companions, testing not just their bodies but their minds. For Alvarenga, the fight had only begun. For Cordoba, the will to fight was slipping away. The ocean dictated everything now. Each sunrise began the same way. Alvarenga scanning the horizon for a shadow of a ship, a glint of metal, anything that might mean rescue. His heart leapt at mirages, clouds that seemed like sails, or distant flashes that turned out to be nothing more than waves catching the light. Cordoba had stopped looking. His eyes were sunken, his voice quieter each day. Alvarenga refused to let despair consume him. He set to work, fashioning lines out of stray cords, sharpening hooks from metal scraps, and using birds' bones as tools. Anything that touched the boat became potential food fish that jumped too close, sea turtles that surfaced to breathe, even jellyfish that drifted past, their stings tolerated in exchange for nourishment. The ocean gave just enough to keep him alive. When a turtle was caught, he would cut into it with his knife, drinking its blood to quench his thirst, chewing the raw flesh, and saving what he could for later. He discovered that seabirds often carried small fish in their stomachs, which he would squeeze out and eat. Rain became holy, a salvation that arrived without warning. He spread out clothing and containers to catch every drop, drinking until his belly ached and storing what little he could. But the days between rainfalls were torture. His lips cracked, his tongue swelled, and his vision blurred from dehydration. Cordoba, already weakened, began refusing food altogether. The sight of raw meat sickened him. He begged for fruit, for bread, for anything that wasn't crawling with salt and slime. But there was nothing else. By the third month, Cordoba could no longer keep up. His body thinned to bone. His movements slowed, and his words became slurred with exhaustion. Alvarenga begged him to eat, to drink, to fight alongside him. But Cordoba shook his head. He whispered prayers, stared at the horizon, and seemed to slip further into a place Alvarenga could not follow. One night, under a canopy of stars, Cordoba lay back against the boat, his breathing shallow. By dawn, he was gone. His body lay still, his eyes unblinking, his chest unmoving. Alvarenga froze. The sea was silent, the boat heavy with grief. For days, he kept Cordoba beside him, speaking to him. Unable to accept the truth, he cleaned the body, prayed, and hoped that somehow, by some miracle, life would return. But the ocean was not merciful. The body began to change, and Alvarenga understood he could not keep him there. With tears streaming down his face, he wrapped Cordoba in cloth, whispered a farewell, and slid him into the sea. He watched as the Pacific carried his companion away, leaving him utterly alone. Loneliness became its own predator. Days blended into nights, and Alvarenga fought to keep his mind intact. He spoke aloud, telling stories to the waves, to the birds, to Cordoba's memory. He argued with himself, debated with voices only he could hear, laughed one moment, and cried the next. Hallucinations haunted him, visions of islands that vanished, of ships that dissolved into clouds, of family members calling his name. But when the delusions faded, the truth remained. He was one man in a small boat, surrounded by a vast and indifferent sea. To survive, he created rituals. He woke at dawn to search for fish, drank whatever rain he could, cleaned his tools, and patched up his makeshift nets. He forced himself to move, to work, to think. Idleness was deadly, for it invited despair. Every sunset he whispered prayers, thanking God for another day, begging for rescue, clinging to hope that tomorrow would bring salvation. He did not count the days anymore. He measured time by the phases of the moon and the migrations of birds. By now, months had passed, and Alvarenga's ordeal had shifted from physical survival to a mental battle. The sea had become both his executioner and his provider, giving him fish and water just enough to prolong his suffering. Yet he refused to surrender. He told himself again and again that he must live. For his daughter, for himself, for the simple act of defying the ocean. With Cordoba gone, the weight of survival rested solely on his shoulders, and he would carry it for as long as it took. The Pacific was infinite, but so, it seemed, was the human will. Alvarenga's true test had only just begun. He woke into a world made only of sky, water, and the tired creak of fiberglass. A narrow rectangle of life drifting across an ocean so wide, it could erase a man's name if he let it. With Cordoba gone, silence learned his name. But Jose would not let it swallow him. Before the sun climbed and burned the boat into a skillet, he forced his body into motion. Check lines, check knots, check bottles, check knife. Breathe. He inventoried what remained as if counting blessings frayed rope he could unravel into cord. A dulling knife he honed on the transom edge, a strip of tarp to bend into shade, a cracked bucket, the boat's empty ice chest for storage, and a will that refused to die. Routine became his shelter. He watched the sky the way a hunter watches brush, reading the temper of the clouds, tasting wind for rain, following the winged scribbles of frigate birds that wrote secret messages across the horizon. When their looping arcs tightened and their heads cocked to the water, he dropped lines baited with slivered flesh and pulled hand over hand until his palms blistered, then toughened, then split again. Mahi. Triggerfish. A turtle when luck bent in his direction. He thanked the sea aloud, cut clean, swallowed raw, and saved what he could in the chest for the hours when luck forgot him. Fresh water demanded prayer and invention in equal measure. When storm bellies boiled up from the rim of the world, he stretched shirts and the shredded tarp across the gunwales, nudged bottles into the drips, and listened to the delicate knock of rain becoming future days. When the sky turned brass and withheld, he hunted moisture wherever it hid in turtlenecks and livers, in the slick bellies of gulls, in dawn beads of dew smudged from the hull and wrung into his mouth. He taught himself to sip rather than gulp, to wet his lips before swallowing, to accept that thirst, like fear, was not an emergency but a condition to be managed hour by hour. Sharks discovered him the way they discover anything alive and trapped. Shadows first, then a nudge, then the trial thud of a head against the hull. Once, in black water, a thrash exploded aboard the boat, turned drum. Air ripped by salt and fin until he stabbed blindly and the sea took the shape back. Another day he hauled a small shark in on a short line, turned fear into food, and learned the economy of the body. Which organs to eat first, which meat soured fastest, which taste meant live another day. He gagged, swallowed, gagged again, then steadied. The ocean did not care about his preferences. It cared only that he keep his side of the bargain work, endure, do not waste. Storms taught a different grammar. Wind stacked the sea into ribbed hills that lost their faces and broke into white ruin. He tied everything twice and trusted knots more than he trusted hope. Lightning unstitched the sky and stitched it again, making the world briefly too bright to bear, and then throwing him back into ink. He braced his feet against the ribs of the boat and counted heartbeats through impacts that felt like verdicts. When the wind finally fell away, he bailed until his spine shook and then lay flat, listening to the hull tick as it cooled, a sound like breathing, as if the boat were alive with him. Loneliness required management the way hunger did. He talked to Cordoba, to God, to the horizon, to a small brown bird that discovered him and returned for several mornings, hopping along the rail like a listener who never judged. He fed it fish flakes, thanked it for coming, and told it stories he could not tell the empty air. He named clouds for places he missed. He narrated the day aloud so it would not blur. Some nights the ocean offered him mirages that tasted like rescue, the gleam of a shoreline that lifted and resolved into a band of cloud, the ghost of a mast that turned back into sunlight on a swell, the call of his name that was only wind moving along the taut edge of the tarp. He learned to greet the trick and then argue it away gently, because rage wasted water and despair spent strength he could not afford. His body adapted where it could and unraveled where it couldn't. Muscle washed away, joints sang with ache, salt sores opened and hardened, hair bleached, lips split, eyes burned. He wrapped his hands in strips of cloth and moved his feet from plank to keep their skin from cooking. He paced the little deck in slow ovals to remind his legs what land had felt like. At night, when heat finally lifted and stars multiplied until the heavens became a cold cathedral, he rehearsed ordinary things so they would not fade. The weight of a door in his palm, the smell of a kitchen at lunchtime, the shape of his daughter's laughter braided with radio static. He refused to let memory erode, because eroded memory is the cousin of surrender. There were nights when the world shrank to an inch of wood and knuckle and will. A rogue swell landed square and the boat half filled. He gripped the gunwale and told himself not to flinch until the weight found its level. A line snapped and whipped his cheek. A hook buried in his thumb and he pushed it through rather than tear it free, because the sea teaches you to choose the pain that leaves the least damage. When morning came without rescue, he turned to work again, because the body believes the hands. Do this next, then that. Wake, search, catch, drink, fix, sleep. Time smoothed itself and lost its numbers. He stopped counting days because arithmetic was a kind of enemy. Instead, he measured by moons and birds, by the season when storms walked more often, by the arrival of rafts of weed and the color shift in the water. He learned the quiet language of currents, how the bow pointed a few degrees differently when another river inside the sea took possession of him. He watched for driftwood, for nets, for plastic crates, for any human debris that might be turned into tool, roof, or cup. Once a coconut bobbed past, and he nearly dove after it. He snagged it with a line instead and drank like he was drinking a month. Then, after a span of time he could feel more than count, the pattern changed. The birds thickened into tight circles and dove with a purpose that spoke of nearby shallows. The blue beneath him lifted toward green and showed its grain. Suspended life freckled the water. The wind softened and carried a rumor not of salt or rot or rain, but of leaf and damp soil. He stood and felt the boat tilt differently under his weight, as if a long, patient hand were guiding it. He tasted the air again and could not pretend he was wrong. He lashed the shelter, tied down his bottles, ate carefully to bank strength for whatever waited where flat world became broken line. Dusk kept the secret a little longer. A black seam holding. He slept in shreds and woke to gray. And there, very small and very far, the seam was no longer straight. A low curve rose, and above it a thin white lifting like breath where ocean tripped on land. He laughed once, the kind of laugh that breaks and repairs a man at the same time, and set his eyes on the place where hope had put its thumbprint on the horizon. Land was first a rumor, then a suggestion, then a stitched line of palms and scrub that refused to vanish when he blinked. The color of the water shallowed to jade, the swells shortened, and the boat began to speak a new language against sand. José's hands shook so hard, he had to sit. He forced himself to do the simple things that had carried him this far: secure the bottles, pull the lines, brace the knife, breathe, because the most dangerous hour of a long ordeal is the one you dare to believe it might end. He let the surf lift the bow and shove it, lift and shove again, until the keel hissed across a sand tongue and settled in water so clear he could see the skittered arrowheads of fish. He crawled over the side because standing belonged to men who had not been erased and rewrit by the Pacific, and he collapsed into a brightness that felt like a blessing and a wound. He kissed the wet sand. He cried without sound. He pressed his face to something that was not moving water and said thank you to a God who had been his only audience for more than a year. Voices reached him, quick syllables he could not yet catch. The rush of feet, the shadow of people cutting across the sun. Two islanders approached slow, hands open, as if to avoid startling an animal. One said hello in cautious English, the other called to a house farther back from the beach. The air smelled of wood smoke and green things, and a sweetness that made his knees fold again. They offered coconuts and held them while he drank, because his hands were not steady, then passed water in a cup and watched him sip, curious and worried at once. Questions tumbled: who, where, how long, but time would have to wait its turn. They helped him up and walked him toward a village bright with tin roofs, and the laughter of children who quieted when they saw the shape of him. A man drawn narrow by the ocean but somehow still standing. They cleaned him gently, found him cloth, let him sleep under a roof that clicked in a wind he could trust. The radio crackled and spread the news from atoll to capital. Castaway, alive. When officials came by boat, he could stand a little, speak a little, tell his name and where the sea had stolen him. They ferried him onward to a clinic where light was white and kind, where needles stung and he did not mind, where a nurse set a hand on his shoulder and reminded him that human touch could be soft. Tests said what the mirror already told: malnourished, dehydrated, scarred, but astonishingly alive. His stomach had become a careful instrument. They fed him in small measures and waited. He slept and woke to a ceiling that held still. Reporters would arrive later, their pens eager for meaning. But the first conversations were quieter. He said Cordoba's name and watched the room respect it. He spoke haltingly of the boy's refusal to eat, of prayers under a sky so wide they sounded small, of the moment he had to commit his friend to the sea because death is as practical as life out there. He did not dramatize it. He did not need to. Truth wears its own hard edges. He told them about the sharks and the rain tricks and the way birds can point to fish and sometimes to land. He confessed to talking to a small brown bird like it was a priest, and to bargaining with God like a market man haggling for minutes. He admitted that some days he wanted to step over the gunwale and sink into quiet, and that every time the image came, his daughter's face cut through it like a flare. Numbers attached themselves to the story as nations measured what they could not quite imagine. The days at sea added up into something that made headlines and arguments. How could a man survive so long? Yet the arithmetic felt beside the point to the person who had lived each hour. He measured the ordeal differently, by first rains and last storms, by a coconut that tasted like a holiday, by the day birds began circling tighter and the air carried leaf smell. He remembered decisions more than dates: to sip not gulp, to work not wait, to bind wounds instead of ignoring them, to thank the ocean even when it tried to kill him because gratitude kept his mind from slipping out through the cracks despair had made. Recovery is its own voyage, less dramatic but no less real. He learned to walk in straight lines again. He ate rice and cried quietly because sometimes kindness tastes like grief. He answered the same questions 100 ways and tried not to let strangers' doubt bruise what he knew with his whole body. He let a doctor tell him that the simple act of keeping his shoes on had saved his feet from swelling and splitting, and he smiled because survival is a stack of small, good choices, not one heroic gesture. When they weighed him, when they took photographs, when they put his name on forms, he felt the tug of land take hold where current had ruled. And then there was home calls that shook his chest, a reunion that made air feel too thick to breathe. The world wanted a miracle story. He wanted a quiet room and the sound of his people moving in it. Still, he stood for the cameras because other men might find themselves alone someday and need proof that a body can outlast what a mind thinks is possible. He spoke of work as salvation, of ritual as shelter, of faith as a rope you throw ahead of you and pull hand over hand. He said the ocean is not a villain and not a friend. It is a fact. And a fact can be survived if you respect it and refuse to surrender. When he closed his eyes at night now, ceilings didn't move. He could hear rain as comfort instead of command. He kept a small jar of clean water by his bed without meaning to, a habit that would probably never leave. Sometimes, he dreamt he was back on the rectangle of boat, with the horizon eating every direction. Then he woke and put his feet on floor that held. Each morning he said a simple prayer that had walked with him all those months. Thank you for this day. Teach me what to do next. He did not ask to be understood. He asked to be useful. For all the numbers and headlines, the story he carried had only one moral worth keeping: endure the hour you are in, and the next, and the next, and one day the line on the horizon will bend and break and become a shore.